There's a quiet whisper that tells every man to find his place, to build his wall, to stand firm against the shifting sands of the world. Most of us chase it, this idea of stability, like a ghost in the fog, thinking it's the surest path, the only way to keep the wolves from the door. We latch on to what we're told is good, what looks solid, even if it doesn't quite fit the shape of our own heart. And for a long time, we might even convince ourselves that's enough. We might mistake the absence of immediate disaster for actual peace, and the steady hum of a predictable life for the music of our own making. That's where you would have found Hank not so long ago. Hank, a name as solid and unpretentious as the man himself. 42 years old, an age where most men have either settled into their stride or are frantically trying to outrun their past. Hank wasn't doing either. He was just there, at the factory, every morning. His frame was solid, built not from gym weights but from years of lifting, pulling, and leaning into the grind, a silent testament to a life lived in service of things heavier than words. His shoulders carried a permanent, slight stoop, as if anticipating the next weight to be laid upon them, a quiet burden etched into his very posture. When you met Hank, he wouldn't be the loudest in the room, never the one to spin a tall tale or command attention with a booming laugh. He was the man in the corner, listening, observing, taking it all in with a solemn, measured gaze. His face, weathered like an old barn door, showed the marks of 4 decades of hard living and quiet dedication. Deep lines fanned out from the corners of eyes that had seen too many sunrises from a car window and far too few from a mountain top. Eyes that held a certain weariness, but also, if you looked close enough, a steady, unwavering light that hinted at something deeper, something stubbornly uncrushed. You might call it resilience. You might call it untapped potential. But mostly it just looked like a man who wasn't about to break, no matter what. His hands, though. His hands told the true story. Knuckles thick as walnuts, calluses like old leather, fingers scarred and stained with grease and steel dust. These were working man's hands, hands that could dismantle an engine and put it back together blindfolded, hands that knew the honest weight of metal and the precise torque required for a tight fit. They were capable hands, strong hands, hands that knew how to provide. But sometimes when they were still, resting on the kitchen table or gripping a lukewarm coffee mug, you could almost sense a faint tremor, a restless energy that betrayed a deeper yearning, a quiet ambition he hadn't yet dared to name. They seemed to ache for something more, something beyond the repetitive rhythm of the factory floor, something beyond just holding on. Yet they always returned to the task, dutiful and dependable, just like Hank. The screech of the alarm every morning at 5 was less a wake-up call and more a prison bell. It sliced through the pre-dawn quiet of the modest house, a familiar jolt that pulled Hank from the barely there comfort of sleep. He never hit snooze. There was no point. The day waited, unyielding. He'd swing his legs over the side of the bed, the old springs groaning a complaint that mirrored his own unspoken one, and then his feet would meet the cool linoleum of the bathroom floor. Shave, shower, strong black coffee brewed in the old percolator, the ritual unchanging, a silent covenant with the coming day. By 5:30, the house was still dim, Sarah usually stirring softly in bed, Jake and Lily lost in their teenage and childhood dreams. Hank would be out the door, the chill morning air biting at his neck, the engine of his older model pickup rumbling to life with a familiar cough. The drive to the plant was a blur of half-lit streets and other solitary headlights, each driver a ghost on the same predestined path. He knew every pothole, every turn, every faded sign along the route to Sterling Fabrication, a place that felt less like a workplace and more like a second skin he couldn't quite shed. Inside the factory, the air hung heavy with the smell of cutting oil and metal dust. The symphony of the machines was a constant, deafening roar. Clatter of the stamping presses, the whine of the grinders, the hiss of the welders. Hank's station was a familiar rectangle of concrete floor, marked by the repetitive dance he performed with raw steel and powerful machinery. He was good at it, better than most. His hands, those capable, strong hands, guided the metal with an instinct born of years, shaping it, drilling it, finishing it to precise specifications. It was honest work, hard work, the kind his father had always championed. But there was no joy in it, no spark. Just the steady, relentless march of the clock, each tick a tiny erosion of his spirit. Lunch was a lukewarm sandwich, eaten alone or with a nod to a few other quiet men, the conversation brief, mostly about overtime or the weather. The monotony was a heavy blanket muffling everything, even the gnawing worry in his gut. Because while the job was steady, the money was a tightrope walk over a canyon. Every month was a delicate balance. Mortgage, utility bills, groceries, clothes for the growing kids. A trip to the doctor for a sniffle could throw the whole thing out of whack. There were always envelopes on the kitchen counter, demanding attention, demanding money he didn't quite have. Sarah, bless her heart, stretched every dollar until it screamed, but some months even she couldn't make the math add up. The quiet burden of being perpetually just getting by weighed on him, a constant, dull ache behind his sternum. He worked harder, took every extra shift offered, pushing himself until his body ached with a fatigue that seeped into his bones. At home, after dinner, the clatter of plates and the kids' chatter a welcome respite from the factory din, he'd find himself in the garage, tinkering. This was his sanctuary, a small, dimly lit space filled with tools, the scent of oil and gasoline a comfort. He'd fix a neighbor's lawnmower, repair an old engine, sometimes even fabricate a custom part for a friend's project. Here, his hands didn't just follow instructions. They created, they innovated. He'd lose himself for hours, the hum of his own thoughts a stark contrast to the factory's roar, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. But even here, the inner demons found him. They whispered of what could have been. Hank had always possessed a keen mind for mechanics, a natural aptitude for seeing how things worked, for improving them. In another life, he might have been an engineer, a master craftsman building things of his own design. But his father, a good man who had only ever wanted stability for his son, had steered him towards the factory. A steady paycheck, son, that's what matters. Don't go chasing rainbows. Real men provide. And Hank, wanting desperately to be a real man, a good son, a dependable provider, had listened. He had buried his nascent dreams under layers of duty and expectation, thinking that was the safe road, the honorable road. The problem was, safe felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. He looked at his hands sometimes, stained and scarred, and saw not just a provider, but a man who had silenced a part of himself. A gnawing guilt often accompanied the thought. Was he truly providing if he wasn't happy? Was this quiet erosion of his spirit a betrayal of the life he could have had? He loved Sarah, loved Jake, and Lily more than words could say. He wanted to give them everything. But the thought, is this it? Would sometimes flash unbidden in the dead of night, cold and sharp. The fear of failure, of letting his family down, of deviating from the path his father had laid out, was a heavier chain than any the factory could forge. He'd push the thoughts down, like an errant spark threatening to catch, and just focus on the next shift, the next bill, the next day. The dream of security wasn't truly his own, but it was the one he'd committed to, and walking away felt like an act of betrayal. So he stayed, quiet and dependable, pushing the limits of his own unacknowledged ambition deeper and deeper into the shadows. The thought, is this it? Would sometimes flash unbidden in the dead of night, cold and sharp. The fear of failure, of letting his family down, of deviating from the path his father had laid out, was a heavier chain than any the factory could forge. He'd push the thoughts down, like an errant spark threatening to catch, and just focus on the next shift, the next bill, the next day. The dream of security wasn't truly his own, but it was the one he'd committed to, and walking away felt like an act of betrayal. So he stayed, quiet and dependable, pushing the limits of his own unacknowledged ambition deeper and deeper into the shadows. Then came the night the floor gave way beneath him. It started like any other Tuesday. Dinner on the table, Sarah's meatloaf, Jake complaining about homework, Lily chattering about a drawing she'd made in art class. But halfway through, Lily pushed her plate away, said her tummy hurt. Sarah felt her forehead a little warm, but nothing alarming. Probably just ate too fast, sweetie, she'd murmured, and Hank had nodded, already thinking about the early start tomorrow. By midnight, it was different. Lily was crying, a shallow, desperate sound. Her skin was hot, clammy. Her breath came in quick, ragged gasps. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Hank's gut. He was already pulling on his shoes, his hands fumbling, adrenaline thrumming through his veins. Sarah was scooping Lily into her arms, whispering reassurances that didn't fool anyone. The drive to the emergency room was a blur of flashing streetlights and his own heart hammering against his ribs, Lily, pale and small, whimpering in the back seat. He gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles ached, a silent prayer forming on his lips, desperate and unpracticed. At the hospital, time stretched and compressed. Bright lights, the sterile smell, the quiet urgency of nurses and doctors. A flurry of questions, a quick exam, then the waiting. Endless, agonizing waiting. Sarah sat beside him, her face a mask of fear, holding his hand so tightly it was almost painful. He just stared straight ahead, trying to project strength he didn't feel, his mind a frantic scramble of what-ifs. He remembered thinking vaguely that he hadn't even called in sick to the factory. It seemed so utterly meaningless now. A doctor, tired eyes behind thin glasses, finally came. His words were a low hum, then individual sounds, then words again. Appendicitis, rupture, surgery, infection. The world tilted. Rupture, surgery, his little girl. He heard Sarah gasp a choked sob. He reached for her, pulled her clothes, felt her trembling against him. His own chest felt hollowed out. The surgery itself was an eternity. He sat there, a useless lump, while his daughter lay on a table, her life in someone else's hands. He thought about his father's words. Real men provide. What kind of provision was this? He couldn't fix this. He couldn't stop the pain. He couldn't protect her. All his years of quiet, dependable work felt like dust. Lily made it through. A few days later, she was weak but recovering, a thin, brave smile on her face. The relief was a tidal wave washing over him, leaving him trembling. He thought the worst was over. He was wrong. The bill arrived a week after Lily came home, a thick envelope marked, "Urgent." He opened it at the kitchen table, Sarah still asleep, exhausted from the nights spent hovering over Lily's bed. The numbers blurred. Then they sharpened, stark and undeniable. 5 figures, higher than his annual salary, higher than their savings combined. He reread it. Again, his stable factory job, the one his father swore by, the one he'd sacrificed his own nascent dreams for, couldn't cover this. Not even close. It wasn't just a bill, it was an indictment. A cruel joke. He sat there for a long time, the paper shaking slightly in his hand. The neatly tended garden outside the window looked unreal in the morning light. The quiet hum of the refrigerator felt like a taunt. All those years, all that stability. For what? To be utterly, irrevocably unprepared for the one thing that truly mattered, keeping his family safe. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. Safe wasn't safe. Chasing someone else's dream had left him standing in the wreckage, utterly powerless, utterly broke. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Sarah was finally sleeping soundly in their bed, a deep, exhausted sleep he envied but couldn't share. He wandered through the silent house, a ghost in his own life, the hospital bill a lead weight in his pocket. The digital clock on the microwave glowed a stark, unforgiving 3:17 a.m. He sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd opened that envelope, and just stared into the darkness beyond the window. The world outside was quiet, oblivious, but inside him a storm raged. He pulled the crumpled bill out, smoothed it flat against the worn tabletop. Every zero on the page was a punch to the gut. This wasn't just money. This was his failure laid bare. A steady paycheck, son, that's what matters. His father's voice echoed in the cavern of his mind, not comforting now, but accusatory. He'd followed the rules. He'd done exactly what he was told. He'd been the dependable provider, the good son, and where had it gotten him? To this, to staring at a piece of paper that could ruin them completely and utterly. He thought of Lily, her small, pale face in the hospital bed, the brave little smile she'd given him even when she was hurting. He had promised himself he would protect her. And yet, when it mattered most, he couldn't. He was a factory worker, a cog in a machine, paid just enough to keep his head above water, never enough to build a real damn safety net. He had traded his fire, his own ideas, for the illusion of security, and that illusion had shattered into a million pieces. A raw, bitter honesty clawed its way up from somewhere deep inside him. He had been so afraid of failure, so terrified of disappointing his father, that he had chosen a life that wasn't his own. He had chosen safe, and safe had been a lie. It had been a cage that kept him from truly preparing, truly growing. He'd been so busy holding onto what he thought was stable, he hadn't built anything strong enough to withstand a real storm. The quiet erosion of his spirit over the years wasn't just a personal failing. It was a betrayal of his family, because a man who didn't bet on himself couldn't truly bet on them either. The thought solidified, cold and hard as steel. He couldn't go back. He couldn't pretend anymore. This life, this stability, it had to end. He couldn't go back. He couldn't pretend anymore. This life, this stability, it had to end. The words echoed in the silence of the kitchen, not a shout, not a declaration to the world, but a profound internal tremor. It was the quiet click of a tumbler lock, the sound of something shifting irreversibly inside a man who had been still for too long. He didn't know what would come next. There was no grand plan, no sudden flash of entrepreneurial genius. Just the chilling certainty that the path he'd been on was a dead end, a path that had led him right to the precipice of losing everything he held dear. The fear that had kept him tethered to the familiar for so long was still there, a cold knot in his gut, but it was overshadowed by something even more potent. The terror of staying the same. The terror of failing Lily again, of failing Sarah, of letting Jake grow up watching his father simply exist, slowly dimming rather than truly live. The night bled into a fitful dawn. Sarah found him at the kitchen table, staring out at the gray light just beginning to filter through the window. She didn't ask what was wrong, she just put a hand on his shoulder, a silent question in her touch. Hank simply shook his head, unable to articulate the seismic shift that had occurred within him. Not yet. He went to work that day, like every other day, the drone of the machines, a familiar, oppressive hum. But something was different. The gears still turned, the metal still screamed, but Hank wasn't just in it anymore. He was observing it, detached, as if watching a play unfold that he no longer had a part in. He clocked out at 3, the usual weariness in his bones, but for the first time in years it wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was a weariness of spirit, a deep fatigue from playing a role that didn't fit. He drove home, the late afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windshield, illuminating the small, unassuming house in his rearview mirror. The house he'd worked his fingers raw for, the house his father had told him was the picture of stability. He parked the truck, got out, and instead of heading for the front door, he walked around to the side to the old, detached garage. It was crammed with boxes, forgotten tools, an ancient lawnmower, and the ghosts of projects started and abandoned. His father had always said, "A man's garage is his sanctuary, Hank. Keep it tidy, keep it practical." And practical it had been for storing junk. He stood there for a long moment, the key cold in his hand. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and dust. This was it. This was where the factory money came from, and this was where perhaps something new could begin. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of pushing metal, knew things. They knew the language of steel, the whisper of a failing bearing, the strength of a perfect weld. For years, those hands had served another man's vision, another man's bottom line. Now maybe they could serve his. He unlocked the heavy wooden door, pushed it open, and the rusty hinges groaned a protest. The garage was dark, save for the single weak bulb hanging from the ceiling. He flipped the switch. Light flickered, then held, revealing the cluttered space. He looked around, his gaze slowly taking in every forgotten corner, every pile of scrap. He thought of Lily, her medical emergency, the impossible bill. And then he thought of the quiet satisfaction he used to get from fixing things, from building things, from making something useful out of raw material. He cleared a small space in the center, pushing aside old tires and cardboard boxes. It wasn't much, just enough room for a workbench and a couple of tools. He found his old welding mask, tucked away on a high shelf, dusted it off. It felt heavy in his hands, familiar and alien all at once. He ran a hand over the worn surface of his father's old vise, bolted to the workbench. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do. He didn't have a business plan, no marketing strategy, not even a product in mind. He just knew he couldn't walk back into that factory again, not with the same quiet resignation. He couldn't just keep surviving. He had to build. He had to prove to himself and to his family that he was more than just a pair of hands on an assembly line. He was Hank, and he had a fire in his belly that had been banked for too long. He started to rummage through a toolbox, the metallic clink of wrenches against each other a welcome sound in the sudden, determined silence. Day one in the garage wasn't a sudden burst of genius, more like a slow, painful crawl. Hank fumbled with the torch, the old arc welder sputtering and spitting like a stubborn mule. His hands, calloused from years of gripping wrenches and pushing buttons on an assembly line, felt clumsy and unsure as they tried to coax a clean bead of weld from 2 pieces of scrap metal. He hadn't touched a welder in 20 years, not since high school shop class, and the results showed it. The weld was ugly, pitted, more slag than steel. He peeled off the mask, the garage air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt metal, and stared at his pathetic handiwork. A wave of doubt, cold and heavy, washed over him. What in God's name are you doing, Hank? The next few days blurred into a grueling cycle of early mornings and even later nights. He'd wake before Sarah and the kids, slip out to the garage, and work until the sun was a sliver on the horizon. Then after dinner, he'd be back out there, the single bulb casting long, dancing shadows, wrestling with metal and his own self-doubt. He tried his hand at a small custom gate for a neighbor, a simple design he'd sketched out on a greasy napkin. The first few cuts were off. The angles didn't quite meet. He ground them down, recut, his teeth clenched, a knot forming in his stomach. The money for materials was tight, scraped together from what little savings remained, and a loan from Sarah's older brother, a loan that felt like another anchor around his neck. Every mistake felt like a punch to the gut, a confirmation of his inadequacy. There were days, especially around the end of the first week, when the factory whistle, faint in the distance, sounded like a sweet lullaby. He'd be bone-tired, his shoulders aching, his vision blurry from hours behind the mask. He'd catch himself staring at his old work boots by the back door, half tempted to pull them on, grab his lunch pail, and just go back. Go back to the steady rhythm, the predictable paycheck, the mind-numbing repetition that, for all its emptiness, offered a certain kind of security. A security that hadn't saved Lily, he reminded himself, and the thought was a splash of cold water. He remembered the doctor's grim face, the sterile smell of the hospital, the crushing weight of that bill. He couldn't go back. Not really. He scraped together enough to buy a few more basic supplies, a bit more steel. He started taking on smaller, odd jobs, repairing a broken fence for Mrs. Henderson down the street, welding a trailer hitch for his brother-in-law's old truck. These were small victories, barely enough to cover his costs, but they kept his hands busy and his mind from spiraling too deep. Each time he completed a task, no matter how minor, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not the kind of pride you got from clocking out on time, but the kind that came from making something useful, something that held together because he had put it together. But the real battle was fought in the silence of his own head. Every morning, the question clawed at him. Are you crazy? You're 42, Hank, with a family. What kind of man throws away stability for a pipe dream in a dusty garage? Sarah tried to be encouraging, but he saw the worry in her eyes. Jake, always practical, once asked him if he was actually making any money yet. Hank just grunted in response, but the question stung. He wanted to tell them it was going to work, but the words felt hollow even to him. One particularly bad night, a little over 2 weeks in, he was trying to bend a piece of steel for a custom railing, something he'd promised to a local diner owner. The metal just wouldn't cooperate. It kinked, it warped, it tore. He slammed his hammer down on the workbench, the clang echoing through the quiet neighborhood. He threw his safety glasses across the room, watching them bounce off a stack of old tires. He was covered in grime, exhausted, defeated. He slumped onto an overturned bucket, burying his face in his hands. He could feel the familiar ache of failure, the bitter taste of inadequacy. This is it, Hank. You tried. Now go back, before you lose everything. But then an image flashed through his mind. Lily, small and pale in that hospital bed, a thin tube running from her arm. And then another image. Lily, a year later, laughing as she chased a butterfly through their small, neatly tended backyard. He pictured Jake sketching designs for some contraption in his notebook, his mind already brimming with ideas. And Sarah, who had always believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. He didn't want to teach them that safe meant settling. He didn't want to show them that fear was a reason to give up. He lifted his head, his jaw tight. The garage was still, save for the hum of the old fluorescent bulb. He stared at the mangled piece of steel on the workbench, then at the tools scattered around it. He picked up his hammer, not to throw it this time, but to hold it. He took a deep breath, pushing past the burning in his lungs, past the self-doubt that whispered in his ear. He looked at the problem again, not with frustration, but with a renewed, stubborn resolve. There had to be another way to bend that metal. There had to be. He wasn't going to quit. Not tonight. Not yet. He just wasn't built that way. He picked up another piece of raw steel, feeling its weight, its potential. He picked up another piece of raw steel, feeling its weight, its potential. The night wore on, the garage light a lone beacon in the pre-dawn dark. Hank didn't conquer the metal that night, not completely, but he didn't stop either. He learned its temper, its resistance. He made mistakes, sure, but each one taught him something, carved a new pathway in his mind. He finally stumbled back to bed an hour before his factory alarm, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settling over him, but underneath it, a tiny spark. Not hope, not yet. Just a stubborn refusal to give up. Days turned into weeks. The factory whistle still pulled him in, a necessary evil, but his evenings belonged to the garage. Sarah would find him there, grease smudged across his cheek, a focused intensity in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. The house sometimes smelled faintly of cutting oil, a new scent replacing the usual sterile factory tang he carried home. He started small, taking on odd jobs for neighbors, fixing things the big shops wouldn't touch. A broken gate for Mrs. Henderson, a custom bracket for a local plumber. Each small success was a stone laid on a new path. Each dollar earned felt different, cleaner. It was his dollar earned by his skill, his sweat. Jake, his son, started spending more time in the garage. Not just playing, but watching. Hank would explain the properties of different metals, the principles of leverage, the art of a clean weld. Lily, though still recuperating, would sometimes peek in, her small face alight with curiosity as she watched her dad, not just the tired factory man, but a creator. Sarah saw it all. She saw the lines of fatigue on his face, but she also saw the diminishing shadows in his eyes. He wasn't just existing anymore, he was building. And in building his future, he was rebuilding himself. One evening, about a month after that dark night, Hank looked at the small pile of custom parts he'd fabricated. He'd just finished a complex piece for a classic car enthusiast, a piece the guy had said was impossible to find. The payment tucked into his pocket was more than he made in 2 weeks at the factory. He didn't just feel pride, he felt a quiet, profound sense of rightness. This wasn't just work, it was his work. He saw the potential not just in metal, but in himself. He could see a path, a real path, not just a dim, fog-shrouded road. He walked into the kitchen where Sarah was helping Lily with her homework. "Honey," he said, his voice steady, "I'm putting in my notice at the factory." Sarah looked up, a spoon clattering to the table. For a second, he saw the fear flash in her eyes, the echo of all their past struggles. But then she looked deeper, saw the conviction etched on his face, the nascent empire in his gaze. A slow smile spread across her lips. "It's about damn time, Hank," she whispered, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. The transformation wasn't instant, like flipping a switch. It was like watching a tree grow, slow and deliberate, but ultimately unyielding. Hank's fabrication started small, just him and his tools in that garage. He reinvested every penny, buying better equipment, learning new techniques. He took risks, calculated ones this time, fueled by a self-belief he never knew he possessed. He started hiring, first a retired welder from the factory who understood his drive, then a young apprentice fresh out of trade school with a fire in his belly. The garage expanded, then a small workshop down the road. He was still Hank, the man who rose before the sun, whose hands were calloused and face smudged. But he moved with a new confidence, a quiet authority. He made decisions, big ones, and stood by them. His children saw him not just as their provider, but as their mentor, a man who had faced down his fears and forged his own destiny. Jake now spent his evenings designing parts for his dad's business. Lily helped organize the office, her small hands navigating spreadsheets with a focus learned from watching her father. Their house, once perpetually, just getting by, was now a home built on purpose, not just stability. "I spent so long," Hank would tell Jake sometimes, looking out at the humming workshop, "trying to be what someone else wanted, thinking that was the safe road. My old man meant well, he just wanted me secure. But safe ain't always right. It nearly broke me chasing that ghost." He paused, a faraway look in his eyes. "Turns out the biggest risk was never betting on myself." Once I did, things finally started to click. And Hank, the quiet factory worker, the man who once thought his fate was sealed, had built his empire. Not an empire of land or gold, but an empire of grit, skill, and an unshakable belief in his own two hands. He showed his children, and anyone who cared to listen, that the biggest walls we build aren't made of brick and mortar, but of the doubts we carry in our own minds. And that sometimes, the only way to truly find your way home is to step off the path every